take it away.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here with all of you, especially in these difficult but interesting times. It's a pleasure to be able to speak about writing because, as we all know, storytelling is as old as mankind. And one of the central roles of storytelling, why do we tell our stories, is that it is a way to give shape to chaos. And in many, many cataclysmic and challenging times throughout the history of man, there have been writers who have documented the times they were living through. And in so doing, did for all of us and for generations after them, provide a sort of eyewitness account in terms of narrative of what it felt like to be there then. We happen to be living in yet another one of these times. For a variety of reasons, the last 5 months have not been anything any of us would have possibly imagined. And yet it is a very fruitful time for storytelling. It may not be, and this is one of the central things I want to convey today, it may not be a time where you are going to come out with a lot of finished products. I see, some people will, but I see it as a very fruitful generative time for all of us to get down as documents what we're experiencing personally, what the people around us are experiencing, and really sort of give voice to your observation of this particular zeitgeist that we're in. A generative process is one that I want to talk about and share some of my own strategies that I share with my students. Is a time where you can almost consider it a sprawl of observation, a sprawl of language, and really have fun with it, because getting it down is the most important thing. As I have said over many, many years to myself, my students, the only bad draft is the draft that doesn't exist. Get rough drafts down. It may be a rough draft of a rough draft of a rough draft of a rough draft. But whatever it is, this is the time to really be documenting our thoughts, our feelings, our observations. I write memoir. I came to writing late in life, relatively speaking, after a career of editing other writers for the Paris Review, as Ben pointed out, and then later at Tin House. And it has been my job, both as an editor and as a workshop instructor now, to lure stories out of others. I believe we all have stories to tell. We all have stories. We live in this world. And I have felt really fortunate that people have trusted me with their stories in a process of shaping them. And because of that, I, in a way, was very, very tentative about coming to my own work. I knew from the other side of the desk, from the editing side of the desk, how challenging that is. One of the most challenging parts is honesty, which sounds like a simple thing to say, but it's actually, when you think about it, not that simple. We all tend to fudge our own experience in the retelling. Partly we do that for dramatic purpose, and partly we do that because we're not always honest with ourselves in the way we tell a story. So I like to pare it all the way back to the most essential ingredient to me, and that is memory. There is a reason you've remembered things when you come to write about them. Memory can be very selective, and yet at the same time, it can be very, very inspiring. One thing that puts people off the practice of writing memoir that I want to dispel right away is people say, but I don't remember it exactly. And I don't really remember what Aunt Emily said to Uncle Fred at the Thanksgiving dinner. I know vaguely what she said, but it was important and I don't really remember it. So I can't write it because I don't remember it and it happened 30 years ago, whatever. I would suggest to you, and I'm going to quote the writer Elizabeth Strout here, that memory is emotional truth. And as emotional truth, it is valid. Now, the story of my memoir starts out with my wedding in 1983. Two families, my family and the groom's family, had arrived at my family's house for what was supposed to be a wedding weekend. And the night prior to that, my father had had a sudden stroke that had been brought on by abrupt alcohol withdrawal. My mother had wanted him to sober up for the wedding, but he'd been a lifetime alcoholic. So I ended up getting married when my father was on life support in the hospital, mainly because my mother really wanted to go ahead with the wedding, and she gave me all sorts of reasons. And then he died the day after. When I came to write about this, it took me a long time to come to it because it took me a long time to fully process what had happened. And that was after years of pushing it away. When I came to write it, I went to each of my sisters and I said, we all have a version of this weekend. Our father died that weekend. All I would like to do is tell the story of what it felt like to be the bride that weekend. And I'm using this as an example because to my mind, it freed me up quite a bit to be able to say, I'm going to write my emotional truth. That's my memoir. Everybody else could write their own. If everybody in my family and the groom's family had written the stories, it would be the Rashomon effect, right? Everybody has their own eyewitness account and how it felt, how it smelled, how it tasted, everything, which is part of the beauty of writing that we do. And it's just important that you stay true to your own emotional truth. That seems like a key thing. Vivian Gornick is a writer who's written a sensational book on the process of writing, on the craft. And I'd like to just, at the beginning of this session, read a very small bit. She says, memoir is neither testament nor fable, nor analytic transcription. A memoir is a work of sustained narrative prose, controlled by an idea of the self under obligation to lift from the raw material of life a tale that will shape experience, transform event, deliver wisdom. In a way, it sounds like a tall order, but in another way, I hope you will hear it as being very freeing, because what she's really saying is tell your story, transform your event. Right now, we happen to be living in an unprecedented time. A lot might feel like it is spinning or has spun out of our control, but not so of our writing lives. And by that, I mean to suggest to you that in terms of the pandemic, for example, we personally, at least I personally, am not going to come up with a vaccine, but I can wear a mask, I can socially distant, I can stay respectful of other people's space, and I can write about my experience right now and what it is like for me to be going through this. By the same token, our country this spring has been once again, thank God, reawoken to the issue of Black Lives Matter. Again, we cannot single-handedly perhaps bend the arc of history, to quote Martin Luther King or to paraphrase him, towards social justice, but we can, by our words, write about it and share our experience, reach out to other writers. These times are times that really are important to get things down, because as writers, what we have is our words. I'd like to use as another example, another time that for many of us felt very difficult in recent times. And that was during the time of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And I think particularly for those of us who are women, it was a difficult time. And I would like to read you just a short bit of what I wrote during that time by way of an example of just getting things down. I was on my book tour, as it happened, on the West Coast during the time of the Kavanaugh hearings in 2018. So this is what I wrote. On the West Coast leg of my book tour, the airplane TV showed CNN reporters discussing the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. A clip showed Mitch McConnell, his eyes darting, the folds of skin beneath his chin quivering, vowing the GOP would plow through the nomination, his words, whatever it took. As I watched from 35,000 feet above, it seemed as if the elephant that symbolized the Republican Party had transmogrified into a gigantic elephant that sat heavily on the coffee table of the American landscape, stretching from one coast to the other, refusing to budge, crushing the voice of the people, determined to have its own way. As a woman, as a writer, I was speaking a lot on my book tour about finding my voice. How for years as a literary editor, I had been coaxing stories out of others because I didn't believe in the power of my own voice. And how I had wrestled blindly for years, as if in the dark, to trust my own words, to believe they had impact, and to tell my own personal story in a memoir. As a woman, as a writer, how was I to address the elephant now bearing down on the national psyche? By the time I reached LA, I watched on a friend's television as Dr. Christine Blasey Ford raised her right hand and raised her eyes upward. Hers was a look I recognized, a woman terrified, yet speaking her truth, aware of the backlash she would inevitably face. She was followed by Judge Kavanaugh, red-faced, spitting rage and defensiveness, then spiraling into self-pity and tears. This is a look I recognize too, a man dangerously wrapped up in his own story, his blatant self-interest. By the time I returned to New York City, where I live, Dr. Ford had been silenced by the giant elephant on the coffee table, and Judge Kavanaugh was being sworn in to the highest court in the land. Why did it take you so long to tell your story? I was asked again and again on my book tour. Why did she take so long to tell her story? Conservative pundits said, attempting to cast doubt on Dr. Ford's testimony. In bookstores, in living rooms, on airport lines, I listened as women told me their stories in hushed tones. It was my mistake to stay silent, I tell them. Speak, write your words. We have to scale back the elephant one slice at a time. And our words are our power. Use your words, I tell them. We start here. Now, I have spoken about memoir as a design build process. What do I mean by that? I mean that we are building a narrative arc with our memories, That's the brick of our story. The mortar is our voice. Voice is incredibly important. But you start with the memory. And often the best thing to do, as Robert said in his talk just before mine, is to start with some prompts. Prompts are very valuable because, in a way, they trigger a lot of memories, and they are done so quickly that you can fool your brain's self-censor into not kicking in yet. You write your prompt, and in writing your prompt, I suggest you set a timer. Set a timer for, say, 20 minutes, an egg timer. You select your prompt and you write for those 20 minutes. You just write. And then when it goes off, it goes off. You put that document in a file. You might then pick another prompt. Or that prompt might have spurred something in you that makes you want to go on from there. And in going on from there, you might then write around that piece that you have already begun. You might think, what did that character who was there, what did they sound like? Or what did I sound like in the story? Why am I remembering this? What's important about it? At some point, you might get to a dead end with it. Put it in the file. It's an important document for later. And then maybe start another prompt if you have the energy to do that. I'd like to suggest a few that I think are interesting ones to experiment with at this time. I have a lot of students from my workshop down in Mexico in Todos Santos who I see during the month of February. That's when we have the workshop. And then the rest of the year, I tend to correspond with them. And quite a few of them have gotten in touch with me in the last 5 months and said, just please give us some prompts because we're at a loss here. Everybody's having trouble writing. So in that way, the prompts are really useful. And here are some of the ones that I have given that I would invite you to consider using. One is living life while sheltering in place. Are you living with people? Are you living alone? If you're living alone, what's that been like? To only be going out occasionally to get groceries or whatever, and otherwise being alone. If you're suddenly living, as I am, with children in their 20s who are usually at this point off in their lives, they're back home. I'm becoming an expert in TikTok and all sorts of other things. They're home. Some of their friends are also living with us. So what's that like? What are the voices? What is the noise that I'm hearing around our house, but also around these issues? There's various people in my household that are kind of getting over this pandemic in terms of just, I want to go out. I'm done with this. And then there are other people who are like, I'm not comfortable with you going out to a restaurant if we're quarantining together. So right there, I've got some dialogue going in my mind, right? So I can write all that down and I can put it in a file for later. Another offshoot of that prompt, which is one I'm very fond of no matter when the occasion is what is home? Has home been redefined in this pandemic time? Certainly it has become the place not only that we live, it's also the place where we work. It's also the place where we work out. It's a lot of things it never necessarily had been. For some of us it had been. For a lot of writers it always had been. So in a way, we may be adapting more than other people because we're used to just sort of working in our pajamas all day. But anyway, so what is home? What do you think of when you think of home? Write about it for 20 minutes. And then when the timer goes off, again, put it down. It could be something that has nothing to do with this pandemic. I gave the prompt to myself, and I wrote about some wisteria that used to be in the house that I had when my children were young, and that brought in a whole other situation that I ended up writing about. So again, these are just ones that, you know, if they intrigue you, just write them. Another one that I've been writing to is insomnia. What is keeping you up at night? What does it feel like to be kept up at night? What is the last thing you remember before you turned off the light? Insomnia is an interesting one because it's something some people are plagued by all the time. And some people, fortunately, are not, but this does seem to be a time when people are having struggles with insomnia. So that's another one I would throw out. These kinds of exercises are limbering up exercises. But as I said, they can also bring something valuable. Another that I like is an article of clothing. There have been many, many times that I have seen and I have read in other memoirs where an article of clothing becomes almost symbolic, becomes almost its own bricks and mortar throughout the narrative arc, if you will. And as an example of that, I would love to bring up Wild Game, which is a memoir that came out by Adrienne Brodeur. It came out this winter. And it's a very intriguing story. I would recommend it. Brodeur, when she was quite young, when she was 14, was awoken one night by her mother, who confided in her at the age of 14 that she, the mother, had just kissed a family friend who happened to be her stepfather's best friend. So suddenly at the age of 14, she was brought into the confidence of somebody that never should have violated. I mean, I think that was sort of the given, never should have violated her daughter's trust in her childhood by bringing her into this. But Brodeur spent her life really as a part of this and in its various permutations. Why do I bring this up? I bring it up because one of the important through lines in that memoir is a family necklace. Her mother has this beautiful necklace that she's always adored, that had been brought to her by her father when they were married. And the mother had always told her, you will get my necklace. I'm going to give you my necklace. And as Brodeur was getting older and older, she kept expecting at some point she'd get the necklace because her mother kept dangling that possibility. And at one point her mother was going to give it to her for her, Brodeur's wedding. And at the last minute, she decided it looked so good with her own dress. She did not give it to Brodeur. She did not give it to her own daughter for her wedding. I won't go any more into what happened other than to say it's a wonderful memoir to read, both for the sake of story, but also for the sake of craft. But what I will say is that that necklace became a very important item that she chose to symbolize and also to speak to exactly what kind of person her mother was, what kind of mother-daughter relationship they had going, but also to the larger whole that had something to do with vanity and narcissism, and also had to do with Brodeur's own hesitancy to speak out, to speak up for herself in these situations. So it was a very interesting thing. Now, I'm not presuming that that came from a prompt. However, I do know with students, I have given that prompt an article of clothing, and it has produced some really interesting through lines in a story that was already there. So even if you're telling a story about something else and you get stuck somewhere, you can insert in your own writing day another prompt to give. And by so doing, you might just find it going in another direction that's of interest to you. So it's a good thing to try. Now, the next thing is when you have all of these pieces of paper from your prompts. You should also be just taking notes, even if it's on a cocktail napkin and you're out to dinner. If you eavesdrop on something you hear that reminds you of something, if it's, you know, I once pulled a marketing receipt out of my bag and wrote something down on the street because I suddenly remembered something that I wanted, that I'd been trying to remember for my memoir. When you get all of these pieces of paper and matchbooks and cocktail napkins and grocery receipts, when you have them all, I suggest the next step might be, and you decide you want to try to build a narrative arc and make a memoir story, I suggest the next thing is to literally bring an element of physicality into the process. Either make a chart, get a big whiteboard or a blackboard, and you can even draw a huge arc on it. And then you can drop down themes, characters, places. Another way to do it is to just put it literally all on the floor and start to build an arc that way. And you can, again, have columns coming down. Another way to do it is Post-it notes or a bulletin board. There are a number of ways to do it. But the physicality, why do I suggest that? I suggest that the physicality of doing that somehow frees what is in your brain. It connects it to your hand, it connects it to the page. And it's the same way that a lot of people prefer to actually write by hand their various drafts. Again, it's the physicality. It's the brain to hand to page. Some people write first drafts one way, and then halfway through they might decide to take to the computer, and then suddenly they're writing an excerpt that has something to do with some other part of it, and then that ultimately all gets put in the chart. Again, I do feel that this is all possibly the rough draft of the rough draft of the rough draft, and that is quite fine. It's all just a part of getting it down. The other reason that I suggest the physicality and doing it in a way where you can actually see it, and I've also suggested ways you can see it that move, is because moving it around is somewhat inevitable. There are many times where I have thought something that was at the very beginning might end up being in the middle, or might end up not appearing at all, or might end up being in a final scene. So you want, over time, as you're building your story, to be able to move these elements around. And that is the way you're literally going to be able to see your story as a narrative arc, a beginning, a middle, an end, with a lot of drop downs in between that might be scenes, that might be snatches of dialogue, that might be documents that you somehow want to refer to. So don't feel bad about sprawling. Sprawl is really important, I think. The other thing I suggest is blogs. Blogs are a great way to establish a daily practice, even if it's a blog that you don't share with anybody, at which point I want to separate it from a journal entry. A journal entry is something different. That is, journaling is a different experience. A blog is something where you're actually being writerly. You are trying to communicate not only to yourself, but to others. And again, even if you don't share it, it's the daily practice of putting it out there. You may find gems in there that you want to keep, but at any rate, what you're going to do is you're going to have documents. You're going to be able to really see what's going on. And that is the best way to truly see what it is, what the story is you want to tell. Because often it changes. You might say, I said, for example, when I was writing my memoir, I said, okay, I'm going to write about the weekend that my father died and I got married. And that did end up being the entire first section of the book, but then there were two other sections of the book that had to do with the repercussions of both the families of the bride and the groom based on what happened that weekend. And that follows over a 20-year span. I had no idea when I wrote the first section that that was going to happen. But while I was writing it, I thought I could spread the whole thing out over the course of the weekend. But that's not really what I want to address here. What I want to address is family dysfunction. And the way to do that is to look not only at my own family, which on the face of it, I think we could objectively say was pretty dysfunctional, but also the family of the groom, which that family objectively was not. That was very much the white picket fence and the mom who baked cookies, and something I was very attracted to that family because of the whole white picket fence atmosphere that I saw. And it was not until I really was writing the first section that I thought, no, I want to write a second section that's all about their family in dysfunctional moments that came afterwards. So again, just put it out there. And don't worry at all if the material that you are generating now doesn't find its way necessarily into a finished project for a long time. It's quite normal, if that's the right word. It's not unusual when we are writing in cataclysmic times for the work to take quite a long time to process in the mind of the writer. I remember right after 9/11 thinking, in a few years, there will be a lot of literature that will come from this. But sure enough, it was a few years. And then there were novels, there were memoirs, there were plays, there were movies. But it was completely normal that it would have taken a while to do that because it had to be processed. The writer had to process it. What is my story? What did this personally mean to me in the backdrop of what it meant to the world? So I think you have to be patient. Don't rush anything. Processing material takes a long time sometimes. And there are many, many stages to it. One other thing I want to bring up, and just in a way to warn against, is it seems to me that rage is an important thing to talk about when we're talking about craft and the craft of telling our own stories. Rage can be fuel, and sometimes it can be the germ that sparks a piece. We all have a lot to be angry about right now. Get it down. However, I will say that rage alone as an unmitigated howl is never going to become, for a reader, a fully experienced piece. Why? Because it is an emotion. It's a howl. What needs to be looked at and explored is, how is this rage impacting me? How is it impacting my life? How is it impacting my story? If a memoir comes from a place of negativity, if it's revenge memoir, or if it is anger, if it's malice on any level, you need to get it down, but then you need to step back and say, where is the art in this? Where is the story? Why am I telling this story? If the answer to why am I telling this story is because I want to get back at that person, that's not a good reason. Maybe that's a good reason to take it up with that person, but that's not a good reason to write it. I would say that the other thing to ask yourself is, do I feel that I have been true to every aspect of this if I'm writing from a place of rage? Is there an exercise I could give myself just for a minute, or a prompt I could give myself where I would write from another character's perspective? And in so doing, I'm not saying this is, I mean, maybe in a novel that might be useful material to use. In fact, it probably would be. In a memoir, it's useful just in terms of understanding the different dimensions of a story. And so rage is useful, malice is useful, revenge is useful only in how you look at all the dimensions of those feelings and use them as a way to understand the other characters, to understand other people's intentions and other people's versions of the same story. That can be very useful. I'm not saying that you should tell their story, and I'm not saying that you should let their experience cloud what you're writing. I'm just saying that it is a good way, a good exercise, so that you're seeing all the different players, sort of the way a playwright does on a stage. A playwright is thinking about every single character on that stage and how they're experiencing it. That is a really good exercise for us, even as memoir writers, to do that, just in terms of understanding the character. So I think that I'd like to just reiterate in closing that the most important thing is getting it down right now. The most important thing is realizing that in telling our stories, in using our words are our power. Never let yourself be daunted. Never say to yourself, this isn't good enough. Good enough for what? It's your story. And the important thing is to tell it. In closing, I just wanted to read one more small piece of the Vivian Gornick, and I do recommend her book, The Situation and the Story. It's really wonderful, wonderful book on craft. Here we go. Truth in a memoir is achieved not through a recital of actual events. And that's very important. It is achieved when the reader comes to believe that the writer is working hard to engage with the experience at hand. What happened to the writer, and this is really important, what happened to the writer is not what matters. What matters is the large sense that the writer is able to make of what happened. That's what separates memoir from any other kind of documentation, from a police blot or even from a biography, an autobiography. It's what the writer makes of what happened. For that, the power of writing imagination is required. As V.S. Pritchett once said of the genre, it's all in the art. You get no credit for living. So I'd love to encourage questions if anybody has any. And also please email me if you have any questions that come to you later. On my website, you can get in touch with me there, JeanneMcCulloch.com. And you could also get information about my workshop in Mexico if ever we can go again to Mexico, but we're going to be doing it online this year. So I see there's one question, so let me take a look. This is Melissa. How do you manage through the fear of hurting others directly involved in the story that your own narrative is compelled to tell? Thanks for that, Melissa. How you manage, I gave one example, which is when I went to my sisters and I told them I was going to write it. I think it is important to give a heads up to people who really matter to you, and it's only you know who they are. If you think they deserve a heads up, they deserve a heads up. The guy I married at this wedding in 1983, he and I did not stay married for a long time. I think we were together 5 years, but we stayed in touch. And in fact, he was one of the people who had urged me to write the story of the weekend of our wedding. And he read the manuscript before my editor did, before my agent did. And I wanted his okay. I don't know that I would have changed anything if I hadn't had it, but I knew that he, because he had his own experience too, he would have the kind of insight that made it almost feel as though it was a joint project, only in the way that, in that we did experience it together. And that's one thing that has always bound us, actually. And he was fine with it. I did change the names of everyone in his family because I felt I haven't seen them in 30 years. It didn't seem right to write something so personal about them, because the second section really is all about them, and use their names. They're from a small town. It didn't seem right. One thing I learned after the fact is there were some other people I probably should have alerted that I was writing this. I have 4 half-siblings, 3 are still living. And I did write honestly about our father's alcoholism, which was really hard for me to do. And I feel that I owed it to them to talk to them about it, and I didn't do it. So that was just note to self for the next time. I think people that might really be hurt in that way, you owe it to them. And afterwards, when 2 of them were upset, I offered to talk to them about it, because I think it's the responsibility of the writer then to own your work. And I have been actually on both sides of this. I have been twice in other people's work. And one time the writer sent me a galley, actually, and was very straightforward about it. Second time, not so. And I valued having the heads up, and I valued being able to talk about it. I do think that's important. It shouldn't stop you from writing. And it did for a long time with me. My mother said, "Don't you dare write about me until I'm dead." As it happened, I didn't write about her until she was dead. But, you know, that probably held me back a lot longer than it should have. So I hope that answers the question. If not, contact me on my website if you'd like to talk about it further. I'd be more than happy to. Amy, what was the last book you read from, please? The Situation and the Story by Vivian Gornick. And as I said, I highly recommend it. The Situation, the Story, it's in paperback. And it really is, of the books by writers on writing, it is one of the ones I recommend the most highly. Any other questions? Let's see, I think there might be one more here. Oh, okay. Because my own story is still confusing to me, fair enough, I have had difficulty feeling my voice is legitimate enough to tell a story. Any tips other than keeping at it? Yes, I do have a good tip for that. Sometimes we as human beings have trouble validating ourselves. It's just a little quirk of being human, I guess. And this is a really good time for people to feel invalid, is when they are writing something that's still confusing to them, because they feel like they're committing to paper something they're still working out. Well, that is fine. You're writing your way through it. But I find that what is really helpful at that point is to have feedback. Find either a writing partner, one other person who you trust, with whom you can share work in a mutual way, or join a workshop. There are many workshops. You don't have to enroll in a whole writing program that's accredited. There are many, many workshops, such as my own, but there are many, many others. We're going to be doing some actually at 1455 in the future, which is very exciting. And through that, you'll have that teacher, but you'll also, very importantly, have those other participants in the workshop. And often through that, you will meet one or two people with whom you feel you'd like to continue a writing, sharing relationship beyond the workshop. Why is that helpful? Because often when we feel invalid to ourselves, the experience of presenting your work to somebody else validates it in a sense. But more importantly, getting the feedback is important, because sometimes that can help you figure out what's confusing. Somebody might say, yeah, but I didn't get this part. I didn't, it didn't make sense to me that he said this at the family meeting, or da-da-da-da-da. And then you think, oh, well, thank you for telling me that. Then, okay, let me see, what did he really actually say, and why did I put it in there? Why did I remember it and think it was something worth putting in? So there's that. But again, sometimes it takes time to process things. So it's a bit of a combination of all of it. I'm writing something right now. I hope I'm writing it. That is still confusing to me as well. And the two ways that I have gone about trying to understand it more, one is actually through research. My topic happens to be one that I can research. But it's also by sharing the first chapter that I've written with other people and getting some feedback to see if they even get where I'm going with something. Here's one more question. I've been working on a memoir for a long time, but I'm not finished. Do you have tips on finding momentum to finish? That is a great question. My question to you would be, are you having trouble because you don't know yet what the ending would be? Or are you having trouble because you've just run out of steam? And that's what you mean by finding momentum. It sounds like the latter might be the case. And if so, again, going back to what I just suggested, having a writing partner or having a workshop experience can really help in that way, because suddenly it is a real thing. You have put it out there. You have shared it with another human being, and not any human being. You've shared it with another writer. Often that will provide the momentum right there to keep going. The other is, make a project of yourself. Choose a part that you think you could actually possibly excerpt, that would be self-contained as an excerpt, have its own beginning, middle, end, and send that out to magazines for possible publication. It may not get picked up, but the process of doing it begins to give you a sense of finishing. And if you finish that, it can often give you the momentum to finish something bigger. I felt myself as though I didn't know how I was going to finish this book. I have edited books by writers, and I know the experience of doing that. But when it came to myself, I thought, I understand writing a magazine piece. I've written a lot of those, but to do a whole book seemed too monumental to me. And it wasn't really until I had engaged with other people. And I had a deadline also, that also helped. It's harder to get a false deadline. I actually had a HarperCollins deadline that I needed to observe, and that I had missed a few times. So it really was to the point where I had to do it. But that's more of a sort of an outside thing. But you can sometimes within a workshop group or with a writing partner create deadlines for yourselves and stick to them. And that can really help. I think that might be it. Again, as I said, if anybody has any more questions, get in touch with me through my website. It would be my delight to find out more about all of you. I can't see you. That's one of the sad things about being online, as much as I love this forum, because 1455 has been able to bring so many of us together. The one sad thing is I can't meet you in person and get to know you. I'd love to know who's out there. So introduce yourselves if you feel like it. Continue asking questions, whatever you'd like to do. Oh, one more. Need to go. Oh, okay. Amy, good luck. She was just following up with her other one. And one thing Amy pointed out that's very useful for all of us is life has been a big distraction these days, and it keeps getting in the way. I understand that, but use that as a prompt too. Early on in the pandemic, I got a chair I had ordered a long time before was finally going to arrive, and it was arriving at the end of March, just when everybody had like fear of the UPS guy, myself included, and everything else. And one of my children, who's 20, was particularly strict about nothing comes in this house unless we have Lysol the hell out of it. And I found myself when this chair arrived in a big cardboard box on the porch. It arrived early, so I was still in my nightgown, and all I put on was big socks. So I'm in my nightgown, my socks, put on gloves and a mask and Lysol, and I just Lysoled the hell out of this huge box. So I tell that as an example of life has been really oddly distracting, but when those distractions get in the way, write it down, put it in your file. It might be useful later. So I'm gonna leave you all now. But again, thank you so much for being a part of this. And whenever you feel like it, feel free to introduce yourself via my website and we can continue talking. Thank you very much. And thank you to 1455 for hosting us all. I'm excited to see more of the talks. It's been a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful weekend so far. Thank you.